Hey everyone, welcome to Conversations with Curtis. This is Paul, and I am so excited to bring to you my interview with Sam Barlow. Sam is the creator and mad genius of games like Her Story, Telling Lies, and the upcoming Immortality, which just looks amazing. Prior to that, he worked on the Silent Hill games, Shattered Memories, and many other games prior to that. But he is now pretty much the king of FMV games or interactive movie making. And he was kind enough to give me some of his time. He's very busy putting together the last finishing touches on Immortality, which drops at the end of this month. But he sat down with me yesterday in his Manhattan work studio and gave me 2 full hours of his time, which I really appreciate. So we're going to break this up into 2 parts. We'll do 1 hour today, and then we'll do another hour on August 31st, which will be the day that Immortality releases. It was a great conversation. He is a fascinating guy. You can tell he is a right brain, left brain kind of person. I'm just astounded at his ability to remember so many details from so many aspects of his life. I do a lot more listening in this interview than I do in others. And there's a reason for that because he's got so much to say and had such great stories to tell. So I hope you enjoy part one of my interview with Sam Barlow.
I did a podcast recently where they sent me like a kit and it was, very impressive and everything. And then we recorded this thing for 2 hours and 10 minutes towards the end, the host went, wait a minute. I don't think my end is recording properly.
Oh no. Did it not
I
record?
think they had like the recording of the Zoom, but they didn't have his local mic. I think like he was Zooming via his computer,
Right.
microphone, whatever. So, but and as well, it was the first 10 minutes of the call where their tech person was like talking us all through it, and he was like, "We're fine. It's fine. I have this. It's looking good." It's like, okay, no, never skip that bit. Always
Yeah,
let the
right.
tech person.
Well, hey, I want to thank you so much, Sam. I want to welcome you to Conversation with Curtis, and thank you so much for taking the time. I know this is a big month for you. Yeah, that you're about to drop your game soon. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We pushed it back a little bit, and uh, it's looking good there. I mean,
How are you feeling about it? How's it feeling?
I'm almost at the point where I'm getting sick of the game. Not quite yet, though. Like, every time I'm like, okay, I guess I should do a full playthrough just to make sure personally that it's working. I'm still enjoying that. So
Okay.
that's good. I keep regretting deciding to simultaneously ship on like console, PC, mobile at the same time. Uh, it still makes sense. Like, you've hit a bigger audience,
Yeah.
everyone's more excited. But yeah, just the final stages of submitting, and then like yesterday we found a bug that only happened. No one had noticed it because it only happened if your physical hardware was set to a certain region. It was like a bit in the code somewhere that was checking a date string, and it was assuming a certain date format or something. And so this just did not come up until we submitted it to the platform holder. And then they were saying we keep finding this bug, and we were like, this bug doesn't make any sense. Like, this code should never execute. And it turned out that their physical hardware was set to a different region, so at the OS level things were happening. So it's always those tedious
Yeah.
little
Yeah.
surprises, but it's been cool. Like, we had like a phase of playtesting and getting people to play it, and like giving it to fellow devs and stuff to have a play with, and that went well.
Good.
So that was like the first time when you're like, and with these games that I make,
Are
to
you
some
watching
extent,
people play the game, or are you sort of eavesdropping and watching their reactions?
pre-pandemic I would do that, which was excruciating. This time around we just kind of sent them out, and the game like records what people are doing essentially, so you
Okay.
can kind of stick it in a big graph and kind of get a sense of how it's working. But yeah, these things that I make, because to some extent they're a leap of faith, because it's kind of not tried and tested gameplay mechanics, and because they're so reliant on the specific execution of the footage, oftentimes it's not until everything is done that you can truly like get the genuine reaction to how things play out.
Yeah.
So, and I think I'm pretty good at putting myself in the mindset of a player and seeing like beyond what's in front of me to sort of get a
Right.
sense for the things hanging. But yeah,
Right.
that so it's only quite late that we sent out this playtest build, and then we had some early review code that went out because of some print deadlines. So we're getting feedback from the playtesting and these initial kind of press contacts with the experience that it seems to be working, and
Yeah,
people seem to
good,
be.
good. Well, I definitely want to hear more about this game, but I think we can let's sort of see if we can lead up to it. But yeah, it's funny. I went from, um, first of all, I'm coming to the world of gaming very late. I was an actor in a game once a long, long time ago, and it's found some small little resurgence, and it's been fun to, last year I did a little uh, uh, anniversary, 25th anniversary, and kind of did a oral history of the project. But it's turned into something new for me, where all of a sudden I'm in this world I've never been in before. So I had never, as of maybe 3 months ago, I had never heard of you before, but I have very quickly become one of your biggest fans. I just finished playing Her Story, and I'm very deep into telling lies. And I think that what you are doing with this form is nothing short of brilliant. It is one of the most interesting ways to, I think you are on to the way that you are telling interactive movies, whether it's FMV. I mean, I think that it's all semantics. Is it
Yeah.
FMV? Is it whatever? But what you're doing is just fantastic, and I really love your style and the way that you're making this happen. So and I can't wait to see this to see the new one. So yeah. But that said, I guess I feel like my first question to you is, did you ever play Phantasmagoria: Puzzle of Flesh?
I did not. So like my whole relationship, I mean, it's more complicated than that, but like my whole relationship to like that era of FMV gaming is so twisted. Because like at the time, I remember at the time I was definitely like more of a PC gamer, and like adventure games and things like that were my thing. I think I never had the hardware at the time, right? I think like when things like Seventh Guest came out, I didn't have the CD-ROM drive. But I remember like the aesthetics of going through gaming magazines and seeing like some of the screens from FMV stuff and just thinking it was the coolest thing ever. I remember there was a Jurassic Park game, which otherwise was like cartoony graphics, but every now and then a pixelated picture of Laura Dern would come up. And I remember at the time being like, that's so cool. Like that,
Yeah.
there was something about it that was cool. And having grown up with home computing, any of the kind of early digitization stuff, like I remember playing a game called Trantor, which it came on a cassette, and you had to load one side of the cassette just for the title screen, because the title screen had somebody saying Trantor, the stormtrooper, and that was like it. So you had that whole load just to get this little bit of digitized speech. So I definitely, like at the time, knew that it was there and this was a really cool thing. And as someone that was into adventure games and things like that, I was very aware of Phantasmagoria and would have seen all the screenshots and stuff. And then
Did you play any of those games at the time, or just
the
because,
only
like as you said, that you didn't have the setup mostly
the
to?
only one that I remember playing, and I think I probably came to it late in the day because I have a vague memory of someone giving me like 20 or 30. Could it have been on floppy disks? Maybe not. Like, I feel like someone gave me not hand copied copies of discs to play. There was a game called Ripper, which had
Yeah,
like Christopher Walken,
right.
a whole
Dennis
bunch of people
Hopper
in it.
too, right?
And I think Dennis Hopper he was in another one.
Okay,
It was
yeah,
similar. It was cyberpunky. But
right.
definitely remember playing Ripper, but maybe it was a while after that had been a thing. I don't think it was fresh. And remember quite enjoying that. There was a puzzle that stuck out in my mind and was buried away deep in my mind of justifying the use of FMV. There was like a really simple puzzle. Maybe I'm completely misremembering it. That involved experimenting on a chimpanzee. I think someone had like a chimpanzee wired up, and so the puzzle was you had to like turn the dials to do something to the chimpanzee. But like every time you did a dial or pressed a button, you got some kind of live action response from this chimpanzee. And I loved, without even thinking it as a designer at that point, I just remember this layer of, like, my interface was extremely prosaic and simple, right? I was turning knobs and pressing buttons, but the result was playing out as apparently organic live action.
Yeah.
And part of my brain dug that kind of separation. So it wasn't like I press a button and there's some direct action happening in the way that you'd expect with a traditional video game, but it was completely it was completely like understandable to me what I was doing, right? That I wouldn't expect a direct response because I was having to fiddle with these things. So I remember that standing out,
Right.
as a cool,
I remember, when I found out that Christopher Walken was doing, because his game, I think Ripper came out shortly after. There was just a big, there was a period where that this seemed like this form was going to take off, and then it just imploded. They couldn't sustain they didn't have the ability at that point to make this stuff cheaply, or not cheaply, but with it was just too much of a budget. But I remember when Walken ultimately did that, I thought, oh man, I'm my career is about to take off. I'm starring a big budget FMV game right next to Walken and his, and then it all just went away.
Yeah, I mean, it's that area of history is fascinating because so basically that was my direct involvement, and then at some point I went off. By the time I started actually working in video games professionally, at that point I'd moved away from PC gaming, and at that point was really into Nintendo stuff. And like the more I kind of became a designer, the more I was like, oh my god, what Nintendo doing is incredible. So I was very much kind of on that track for a while. But then by the time I brought out Her Story, so this was 2015 when Her Story released, I remember a journalist coming up to me, and I showed it at there was one festival that I showed it, because at that time I was being very frugal with my budget, and so I wasn't traveling to any shows, but there was one show that was in London, so I could get there on a bus or whatever. And I took it to this show in London, and a journalist saw it, and afterwards they came up to me and they were like, what made you want to revisit the FMV genre? And that was the first time I'd realized that's what I'd done, right? I think I started out wanting to do something that was in the kind of detective mystery genre. I wanted to do something that was like experimental narrative. I'd come up to this idea of what about the police interview as a moment, started digging into that, researching it, reading stuff, watching lots of real live video. And at some point during that process, it kind of clicked in my head of like, well, I've been watching all this video, and this was like slightly, probably just as the true crime thing was blowing up with Serial and things like that.
Right.
So it was definitely in the era. I think part of it came out of YouTube, because I was discovering all this police interview footage like on YouTube, where it had been released into the public interest or whatever and uploaded to YouTube. So it was accessible in a way. So I guess there was, once that happened, it took a little bit of time for it to then percolate into kind of, and spread into popular culture.
So that's funny. You didn't realize, I think anybody, the people who know and love and revere the old FMV world, they think that you are taking that and reviving it, and you're like, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. I'm trying to create a new and interesting game.
So what I immediately did after the journalist had said that, I was like, oh crap, I'm probably going to get interviewed about this. So I immediately then like went and did FMV Gaming 101, right? And did my research, reminded myself of the stuff that I was kind of aware of that clearly I think had an influence on me. Like the funny thing about growing up as someone who loved games as like a teenager through the 90s, so much of what you experienced was through the magazines, right? We didn't have the internet. So you would get your monthly gaming magazine, and I would reread and read those things like 100 times cover to cover.
What game made you realize that they could tell stories in a way that just that you connected with in a way that you hadn't expected, and that you were all in?
I think the thing for me was, so when I was me think. I'd have been like 9 or 10, maybe 10, and I was at this small, it was this small little village school in England. And it was so small, there was only one girl in the whole school, and she was the head teacher's daughter. And this teacher was incredible, completely off the grid. Like, he was obsessed with D.H. Lawrence, and some days he would tell us to just go play in the woods. Like, that's a better education. But part of his thing was he would apply for all the grants and schemes. Anything that was free or whatever, he would take. And so I remember we were the first school in the area to have a computer. We had like this one educational computer sat in the corner of the room, and it had on it like three programs. One of the programs, I've tried to track this down. I don't think it exists anywhere. I've seen someone has like a scan of an advert for it, but there was like a text adventure where you're on a desert island and you had to escape. And because there were a lot, this thing was allocated, you basically got, say, an hour a week per kid on this thing. So I would attempt to escape the desert island and then spend the whole rest of the week thinking in my head of things I could do. Oh, what if I tried that? And all these kind of things. And then like a few years after that, soon after that, my parents bought me an Amstrad CPC, which was like a home computer in the UK. And there were three big ones. There was the Commodore, which was the expensive, sexy one. There was the Spectrum, which was the cool punk machine. And the Amstrad was in between. Like, the Amstrad was Alan Sugar, who's our version of Trump, put this computer out, and it wasn't as sexy as the Commodore. It wasn't as kind of earthy as the Spectrum, but it was fine, and I loved it. They bought it for me because they thought it was an educational thing, and I started playing on that. Like pretty much every game. Like, that was back when there were a small enough number of games that if you were someone that played games, you would just play everything. So I'd play sports games and fruit machine simulators and all sorts. But I had a particular love for like the text adventures, and particularly, and I think I wasn't even playing, again, this is how the magazines have such an impact. I don't think on my tape-driven CPC I could play the Infocom text adventures. But I was so aware of them because every month the magazines would talk about them, list solutions, like dig into them. So I was kind of plugged into that. And I remember being obsessed with, there was a game called Suspect, which was a kind of Agatha Christie style whodunit set in the real world with grown-ups, right? There were characters in it that had affairs with each other. And then there was a game that I did have called Corruption by Magnetic Scrolls, which was an attempt to be like the UK version of Infocom. Magnetic Scrolls was set in the world of London finance, cocaine. It was a kind of very Hitchcockian thriller. And so I remember being really, really obsessed with those games. Like, any game that had some texture or atmosphere of being somewhat adult or more sophisticated, and like, those games, as much as I love the more traditional games as well, especially those that kind of dealt with like exploration and those kind of things. Those games, like, that had those verbs and character interactions and the little beats of story that you could get in those games, that was definitely my thing. And I was playing mostly the kind of lesser versions of those games that would run on my machine. So there was a British company called Level 9 who did a bunch of games that people fondly remember based on this character Ingrid, I think, who was a gnome, that were kind of very Douglas Adams, Terry Pratchett kind of British humorous fantasy. But they also did a game called Snowball. So maybe this actually is the moment that you're asking for. This game Snowball, from the get-go, like, just blew me away. It was like a hard sci-fi story about some kind of colony ship, and everyone's in hibernation.
Now, is this one of those interactive fiction games, or is this?
This is text adventure. So this
text
is
adventure. Okay.
I think the version I was playing, it was pure text, but I think there was an option to have very crude pictures.
Okay, gotcha.
And the premise was, this colony ship is being sent across the stars, and something goes wrong, and you are woken up, and so you awake, to this, and it's essentially a murder mystery because at some point you discover that the pilot of the ship has been killed. So you have to figure out who killed them, why, and then stop the ship from crashing into a black hole or something. And just from the get-go, the manual made and this was clearly inspired by Alien, etc., but the manual made a big virtue of the fact the protagonist was a woman, which was not very common back then. And I remember feeling like that just in itself made it very sophisticated.
Huh.
And it came with a mini novella, which was I don't know, probably not the greatest science fiction novella, but like talked about the future and had like stuff in it that just felt very dry and grown up.
Yeah.
And then playing the game, it had its limits. This game is something of a meme because when they put it out, the company, the way they marketed it was they claimed it had something like 200,000 rooms. Like, you know, when people are like, our game world is so big, it's 100 miles square, whatever. At the time, this was like, it has 200,000 rooms, which, you know, sounded huge. But the reality of that was this spaceship had these kind of these rings in which all the freezer coffins stored everybody, and each ring was color coded, and each room within each ring was in itself color coded. So basically, those 200,000 rooms, 199,000 of them were you were in red level, green room, blue, like, you know, it was essentially a little bit of procedural text to give you that many rooms. So it was that marketing shtick was a bit of a joke. But the game itself, like, I remember the point where I discovered this dead body, and without the game telling me, because there wasn't, you know, the games couldn't even have that much text in them, without needing to kind of tell me, I was like, oh shit, like I have to solve a murder mystery. Like, and at that time, in the context of a video game where you're mostly just picking up coins or whatever, it's like, oh, this is very sophisticated. And there was an amazing moment in that game, which I'll now ruin for everybody, where, and this is like one of those things when I later got more deep into like the text interactive fiction world, there was always this kind of argument about the parser driven stuff, i.e. where you're typing in sentences telling the game what to do, versus the kind of choose your own adventure hyperlinked or whatever system. So and one of the things that the parser people would always point to was the parser is magical because you can type anything. And the counterpoint would always be, yeah, but most of the time you're not. Like most of the time you're just typing go east, pick up lamp. But every now and then in a game, there'd be a moment where that type anything actually facilitated something exciting. And in this game, there was a point where you discover, I think near the dead body, a computer terminal. And it has no keyboard or mouse because it's in the future. And so you're like, oh, well, how do I interact with this? And next to it is a visor. And you put this kind of VR visor type thing on.
Wow.
And suddenly the screen comes to life. And you spend a while trying to figure out what else to do. And then you realize, and so this is one of those things where you're like, oh, I wonder if this will work. And you type it and it does work and you feel delighted. The secret to this interface was to look at something and blink. And every time you blinked, it like selected the item on this computer. And suddenly you were exploring this.
Oh, wow.
This computer discovering some of the specifics of this murder mystery. And I remember that being a very cool kind of moment when me and my brothers, and I would be playing all these games, would be me and my two brothers sat around the computer suggesting things, trying to figure stuff out. So I remember that.
At what point do you start playing these, you know, you're playing these games, and at what point do you start to think you can do them? Conversations with Curtis is brought to you by our Patreon members. Without them, we simply could not be doing what we're doing. If you like what we're doing and would like to see more, please consider joining our Patreon family. There's all kinds of perks and rewards, and we sure would love your company. So please consider. And now, back to the show. Is it based on, oh, I would have done this different, this isn't as good, I was hoping this would be better, and I can, you know, do you eventually, how did you dip your toe into the process of making it yourself?
It was not as synthesized a process, because like from day one, having those personal computers back then, even to run a game, you had to type a little bit of code, right? You had to type load, whatever. And for, you know, half the games, you know, you would buy a game every now and then because we didn't, like, they were expensive and we were kids. But a lot of the games would be like type in programs from magazines, right? So you'd buy these magazines and then you'd have to sit and tediously type out hundreds of lines of text. Again, taking in turns with my brothers, you know, error checking each other's work. So, like, from the get-go, that generation of computing, you were probably used to programming in BASIC or doing like basic programming just to use these things, right? So pretty much as soon as I was playing games, I was also creating stuff. And very soon this meant amongst my friends at school, we would make games for each other that we would swap back and forth. And they were very specific. And so part of that I was doing, you know, we were doing like dumb arcade games. We were doing like turn-based kind of XCOM, Rebel Star type things, our versions of those. But also we were doing our own text adventures. And me and one of my friends who was particularly, he was much more able when it came to programming. So we both wrote our own text adventure engines. And his was very sophisticated because it used functions and things. I didn't really know any of that. So mine was cruder. But we would make these games for each other. And pretty much the thing we would do is it would be, I would make a game about him and he would make a game about me. And so the games would usually be the slightly offensive quests, right? It'd be like, you know, get the girl or whatever. And in every stage you attempted to achieve this goal, you'd be thwarted by how useless a person you were. And so that already, like, in making these games for each other, there was an element of me as the author of the game explicitly like screwing with the player and like having some interesting back and forth.
It's like you're playing pranks through a video games.
Yeah, like, yeah. So you'd get all the way to complete the quest, and then there'd be some twist, and it'd be very funny. And then, you know, we'd write in our friends and, you know, bits of our school or whatever. So I was doing that, but I think the tricky thing was, like, growing up, not just computer games, but pretty much anything creative, I really didn't have, which seems weird, I didn't have the comprehension that, like, that was a job you could get. I knew that I loved video games. I even, like, you know, in that era, there were a couple of rockstar kind of bedroom coder game developers. So I knew that, like, normal people did this stuff, but it just never seemed like a thing that made sense or was attainable. Similarly, like, you know, throughout my later teens, I was obsessed with movies and painting, and it never occurred to me, like, oh, maybe I could make my own movie, or I could, you know, be a painter. It was very much, oh, these are hobbies that one has, and you go and get a job, and you might have your hobby. So as much as I was making games, and I remember I got as far as, I made some like pretty basic sort of platform games that I'd coded in assembly, which was hideous. God knows how. I mean, I guess when you're a kid, you have enough time to figure this stuff out. But I remember I made some kind of cute platform game. So I was doing all this stuff, but it never really seemed like that would get put out into the wider world. And then I went to college, and so I'm at university in Bristol. And the cool thing, so this was 98, 99. The cool thing then was, if you were at university, you could go to the computer lab and have unfettered access to the internet, which at the time was quite novel.
Yeah.
And, you know, what's the first thing you do when you get on the internet? Try and find some games to play. And back then, it took a very long time to download a game. I remember paying whoever ran the phone line, because I had to plug because if you wanted to use your internet at home, you had to disconnect the phone, plug in your modem. And I remember having to leave the modem running overnight, which racked up like $30 equivalent or whatever, to download a demo of an Indiana Jones game or something. So games were tricky, but one of the few types of games that you could download were text games.
Yeah.
so much smaller. And so towards the back end of the 90s, there was this wonderful resurgence in text gaming, which was mostly similarly minded people at universities around the world in their computer labs who had a nostalgia for these classic Infocom games. And there were a couple of tools. There was TADS, and there's one called Inform by Graham Nelson. A couple of these tool sets that were created and put out for free. I think maybe you had to buy TADS, but it wasn't too pricey. That allowed you to essentially be using, almost literally in the case of Inform, the same tools that Infocom and people had used, but you could use them to make your own games, and then you could upload them. And there became this very vibrant community, mostly centered on like the old discussion boards.
And is this where is this did this ultimately lead you to the game Isle? Is that what?
Yes.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
So and that kind of put you on the map, didn't it? That was a big that really. What was it about that game? What was it about that game that set it apart from other games in that genre?
So I mean, it's an interesting one because if you look back now, you're like, oh yeah, Sam made Isle, and then he did these things, and he made these Silent Hill games, and then he made Her Story, and it all seems to make sense.
Right.
But at the time, it was like, I made Isle, went off, did some other stuff, made some very unrelated video games, eventually got it, and it started to make sense in retrospect. I mean, that scene, like I say, it was a lot of these very keen, creative, bright young people who simultaneously had this nostalgia for what Infocom had done, and similarly were plugged into all the adventure gaming stuff that was happening, and wanted to break new ground. And because text is cheap relatively, you could, as a solo dev, make something ambitious or interesting. And so there was a lot of one-upmanship in that community of people trying new things, show it off to each other, and you're like, oh wow, that's really cool. And they had every year a competition, an annual competition, which is where 90% of people's efforts would go into, because it was a chance to be judged by your peers and get some attention.
Yeah.
And so I made a game for that competition, and it was fine. It wasn't the best thing. And I think like a week before the competition, my hard drive broke or something, and I kind of had to rewrite it from scratch, and it was kind of sloppy. And it went into the competition, and it did okay. But I remember, this is where social pressure is a good thing sometimes.
Yeah.
For me, the fact that I entered this competition and placed decently, but like it had not been the best showing, kind of really made me feel like, okay, next thing I put out, I need to make sure it's really awesome. And so there was part of me that was like, okay, so I want to push an idea in a particularly interesting way. And I felt like some of what I'd done in this previous competition game was like slightly derivative, slightly aiming at what I thought, would play well in these competitions and stuff. So that was kind of led to Isle, and partly the conception of Isle came from a place of frustration, where, so this community was, like I say, it was super interesting. And one frustration I had was, as much as we were trying to push things, there were constraints, and some of those are kind of intrinsic to video gaming, and some of them were specific. So, for example, there were games like, so Andrew Plotkin, who's like a master in this field, he put this game out called So Far, which was very kind of atmospheric, poetic, symbolic adventure game that I remember like people would compare it to like some of Bergman's stuff, right? In the sense of like, oh, this is touching imagery and has depth of meaning. But even when you played that game, there's this thing you do when you play a parser game, especially when you first boot it up, to kind of kick in the tires and test it. You type dumb things. Yeah. And this goes back even with graphic adventures, right? The better implemented, more polished graphic adventure will have responses to doing silly things, right? If you try and combine these objects or tell a character to do a thing, getting a interesting animation or response, you're like, oh, that's cool. The game predicted that. But in a text game, you'd boot it up, and so very standard. If you type a curse word, you want a funny response from the parser. If you attempt to jump out of a window or eat something you shouldn't eat or punch your friend in the face, like things that have no sense in the narrative you're in, you type them because you want to see the funny response. And this is often like, when you look at the history of kind of narrative video games, especially a lot of those graphic adventures, so many of them lean into comedy because it's a lot easier to deal with that kind of that disconnect. But I was frustrated that even in something as sophisticated as so far, the game would still have these funny, witty responses. I, as a player, would still feel the need to type these silly things. And so part of Isle was me going, well, what about a game where if you type the silly thing, the game goes, okay, let's do that then, right? And naturally that leads to a certain type of story, because if the game is going to allow you to commit every violent, psychotic act you type, right, then that's going to end up being a certain type of story. So that was like
well, and for people who haven't seen or played the game, what I found fascinating is that it is, you create a scenario, and then whatever we type in, that's the end. We're done. And you keep saying that that's the end of the story, but there are more endings. And so there is no winning this game. There's no there. You're not going, you're going to get a response to your verbs, and that's it. But if you decide to keep going, what happens is a story starts to reveal and a history, and you start to go, oh, there's something that happened to this person, and there's something that happened, and there's clearly a death or a love or and it starts to, so it makes you want to keep going in. And this is where I think people immediately, they immediately, see the similarities in her story and telling lies, in that we're starting to piece something together that no one's going to piece it together in the same way, because we're all going to come at it from a different point of view. We'll get all the same stuff, but from a different angle. So was that also very much in your, I mean, it had to have been, but was that, not only were you kind of saying, all right, for those of you who are going to write all this crappy stuff, here's what I'm going to give you, but you were clearly working on a slightly different level as well in terms of storytelling.
I mean, I think that to some extent that was discovered to some extent along the way. And I think like part of the process was me going, well, and as well in attempting to some extent set up this slightly adversarial relationship with a player. It was like, what is the most prosaic, boring setup? And it's like, oh, we're in a supermarket.
Yeah.
We're in a supermarket in the pasture aisle. And definitely, like, I mean, I guess at this point I was super obsessed with like experimental literature and surrealism and cut up technique, and really into some of the kind of stuff that people were doing with video installations and art. So I was definitely, like, outside of interactive fiction, really interested in stories that were asking more of the audience in terms of putting them together, and how exciting that was, because your imagination then becomes a bigger part of it. And I think the thing that was maybe a discovery that has since been a thing that I really love with Isle was the idea of all the smart stuff existing completely outside of the game itself, right? So like I say, when you play Isle, every turn finishes the game, which I think started as a kind of a necessity and then became an interesting aesthetic, because it was like, oh, if I'm going to allow you to do anything in this location, well, if I keep simulating that several turns in, it's just going to become unmanageable, because anything can happen, and then that combines. So this idea of it finishing after a turn became quite interesting. But like you say, what happens is you might type something that gives you a particular story that mentions the name of a character, or gives you a hint at something else that's going on, that then makes you go, oh, I can now come into it and use the name of that character in the thing I tell you to do. And that was always possible. You could have done that the first thing you ever typed into the game, but it would never have occurred to you.
Right, exactly.
So, but that awareness doesn't exist in the game. It's not tracked as a state. It's in your head, like your
Mm-hmm.
knowledge. And to me, like a lot of games and some of, even some of the kind of more puzzle heavy adventures at the time, things like Riven, would have this complexity of puzzle where it was in your head, like it was you sitting back and realizing and recognizing and connecting the dots. And that always felt kind of exciting to me. So that was definitely a thing that I kind of, discovered and played with and appreciated.
Yeah,
And I think
oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
and then I was gonna say the larger narrative ultimately to some extent came out of then the playtesting with that game in particular, because people would playtest it and they would send me the stuff they typed that was not supported. And in seeing that, I would get a sense of like what people were trying to do. Then you're as player, you're almost at that point trying to engineer a certain type of story. And there was somebody wrote a wonderful dissertation about, including some other text games, but they wrote about Isle, and they talked about how there was this arc that existed in Isle, even though it's very nonlinear, where you kind of start off being more playful and silly, perhaps. And at some point, you might be attempting to actually bring about a happier story or a happier ending.
Yeah.
And you can start trying to figure out and then coming up with specific commands to tell the player based on your kind of accumulated knowledge that will actually get you essentially happier endings. And they felt that like that was the message of the piece, was this natural attempt to steer and the types of things you were typing to steer you towards the happier endings were consistent in being about this character reaching out to people and being more open and stuff. And it was so some of that was kind of figured out in the putting together of it.
Yeah, and that's going to lead you. I want to I'm going to skip ahead. I know you had a whole career prior to Her Story, but I have to share with you. So I finished playing Her Story. This is my first page of notes right here of all the verbs that I came up with, and I am dying to. And at this point, anybody who's watching, I have every intention to do spoilers along the way, because there's so much in this that I love. Can you tell me, did the title come first or did the title come later? Okay, so that was part one of my interview with Sam Barlow. Wow, what an interesting guy, right? Stay tuned for part two, which will coincide with the release of his brand new game, Immortality, on August 31st. Meanwhile, if you'd like to see Conversations with Curtis continue our journey, then we would love your support on Patreon. The only reason we're able to do this in any way is because of our Patreon supporters. And quite frankly, we need more of you. So if you can, send a little bit our way so that we can continue to provide the fun content and interviews and live stream game playing that we are providing. Okay, that's it for today. So thank you all so much for joining. I hope you're all doing well. Hope you're taking care of yourselves. Please make sure to join my live stream gameplays of Contradiction Spot the Liar with Victoria Morcell Hemmingson and I on Wednesdays for the most part. And my first time ever playing The Secret of Monkey Island with none other than Daniel Albu on Fridays starting August 26th. Going to be a lot of fun, lots of good stuff, and hope to see you at any or all of those events. Till then, have a good one. Take care. See you soon.